My name is Aria Mooncrest. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I was known for being steady, dependable. The person who didn't overreact, didn't dramatize, didn't demand the spotlight. I built a quiet career, a quiet home, and what looked like a quiet marriage. From the outside, people often assumed I was fortunate, maybe even passive, because I didn't correct them. I let that assumption stand. I've learned that when you move calmly through the world, people tend to underestimate the depth of your awareness. They confuse silence with absence. They mistake patience for permission. I was often described as low maintenance, which sounded like praise but slowly became a role I was expected to perform. I didn't protest. I believed that if I stayed reasonable, things would eventually even out. This story is not about rage or retaliation. It's not a takedown, and it's not a victory lap. It's about what happens when our marriage didn't break. It exposed him. And more importantly, what happened inside me when I stopped protecting the image, the truth surfaced. What you're about to hear is a first-person account of a long, quiet unraveling. There are no sudden explosions here, no shouting matches, no cinematic confrontations. The emotional journey moves slowly, almost invisibly at first, through small moments that didn't seem important when they happened. Moments other people would have shrugged off. Moments I noted, stored, and eventually understood. I'm sharing this story because too many narratives frame change as something loud and obvious. But some of the most irreversible shifts happen internally, long before anyone else notices. This is a story about perception, how others saw me, how I saw myself, and how those two versions slowly drifted apart. It's about the cost of maintaining harmony at the expense of truth, and the clarity that comes when you stop managing other people's comfort. I won't paint anyone here as a monster. I don't believe in cartoon villains. I believe in patterns, incentives, and unspoken agreements that quietly shape behavior. I'll tell you what I observed, what I felt, and what I chose, without embellishment. See this as a documentary of an emotional process, not a courtroom drama. If you've ever felt invisible in a role you were praised for, if you've ever been the calm one, while something inside you was slowly recalibrating, you may recognize parts of yourself in this story. Before we begin, let me ask you one gentle question. Have you ever wondered what would happen if you stopped holding together an image that only benefited others? For a long time, I was easy to describe, at least from the outside. I was the reasonable one, the calm one, the woman who didn't make things complicated. At work, I was introduced as the backbone. Not the face, not the voice, just the structure that kept everything upright. People trusted me with deadlines, with cleanup, with smoothing tensions after meetings where louder personalities had taken up all the oxygen. I was praised for being unflappable, for not taking things personally, for being emotionally mature. In my marriage, the language was similar but softer. I was understanding, low drama, supportive. Friends would say how lucky my husband was to have someone so steady, someone who didn't nag or need reassurance. He would smile when they said it. I would smile too. What no one seemed curious about was why I was that way. There's a strange invisibility that comes with being reliable. When you show up consistently, people stop noticing the effort it takes. They assume it costs you nothing. They begin to build their expectations on top of your silence, like furniture stacked on a floor they never think to inspect. I didn't interrupt conversations. I waited for my turn, and often watched it pass. I remembered details others forgot. Birthdays, preferences, small promises made in passing. I absorbed moods, adjusted my tone, and made space. Not because I was afraid to speak, but because I believed timing mattered. That consideration would eventually be reciprocated. It rarely was. To them, I was background stability, the kind you lean on without looking back. At dinners, decisions were made while I was refilling glasses. At gatherings, stories were told about me rather than with me. Nothing unkind, nothing dramatic, just a steady pattern of being adjacent to importance, never central to it. I told myself it was fine. I preferred depth over attention. I believed that being seen wasn't the same as being valued. I held on to the idea that the people closest to me understood me in ways that didn't require performance. But understanding, I would learn, is often assumed, not earned. My husband, in particular, relied on my calm as proof that everything was okay. If I didn't object, it meant consent. If I didn't raise my voice, it meant agreement. If I handled things quietly, it meant they didn't matter that much. And I let him believe that. Not because I was weak, but because I thought peace was a shared goal. I thought we were on the same side of the image we were presenting. Functional, mature, enviably stable. I protected that image carefully. I corrected misunderstandings privately. I softened truths before they reached others. I became the curator of our narrative. What I didn't realize at the time was that while I was preserving the story, he was benefiting from it. My silence filled in the gaps where his accountability should have been. My composure made his dismissals look minor. My patience translated, in his mind, to permanence. To friends and family, we looked solid, even admirable. People came to us for advice, for reassurance that long-term relationships didn't have to be messy. And I played my part convincingly. Inside, though, I was taking mental notes, not out of resentment, but out of instinct. I noticed patterns, how decisions defaulted away from me. Apologies were phrased vaguely, without change attached. How my discomfort was met with logic instead of curiosity. I didn't feel angry. That's important. I felt catalogued, like a resource that had been labeled stable and shelved accordingly. This is who I was to them. The calm presence, the emotional buffer, the woman who would understand. And for a long time, I understood so well that no one bothered to ask whether I still wanted to. The first time it happened, I almost missed it. There was no argument, no raised voice, no clear offense anyone else could point to and say, there. That's where it went wrong. That's how small it was. Small enough to be deniable, small enough to be forgettable if you weren't the one it landed on. We were at a casual dinner with friends, nothing formal, the kind of night where conversation drifts and no one keeps score. Someone asked a question about a decision we'd made together. Something logistical, nothing emotional. Before I could answer, my husband spoke over me. Not loudly, not aggressively, just decisively, as if the answer naturally belonged to him. I stopped mid-sentence. He didn't notice. Or maybe he did, and it didn't register as relevant. He gave an answer that wasn't wrong, but it wasn't complete. It left out my role entirely. Framed the decision as something that had simply occurred, not something we had discussed at length. Our friends nodded and moved on. The conversation flowed forward without a ripple. I smiled. I always did. On the drive home, I waited for him to mention it. Sometimes he did, those moments when he'd realize he'd spoken too fast or cut me off. But that night, he talked about something else. A project at work, a minor inconvenience. His voice was relaxed, content. I told myself it didn't matter. People interrupt each other all the time. I told myself I was being sensitive. I told myself that if it had bothered me enough, I would have said something in the moment. But I hadn't. What stayed with me wasn't the interruption. It was the assumption. The ease with which my presence had been bypassed. The way the room had accepted it without question. I noticed how natural it felt for everyone else. That's the thing about the first small cut. It doesn't hurt much. It just makes you aware that something sharp is nearby. After that, I became more attentive. Not suspicious, just observant. I started noticing how often my input was summarized by someone else. How my questions were answered indirectly or redirected. How credit and authorship blurred in ways that always seemed to drift away from me, never toward. And still I said nothing. I wasn't afraid of conflict. I was wary of mislabeling the moment. I didn't want to accuse someone of harm when the evidence could still be explained away as a coincidence or a habit. I believed in good faith. I believed in context. Everyone else seemed to forget that dinner completely. It never came up again. No one checked in. No one noticed my pause or the way my sentence never finished, but I remembered it with unsettling clarity. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was clean. No mess, no apology required, just a subtle recalibration of where I stood in the room. That night marked the first time I realized something important. Invisibility doesn't arrive all at once. It's introduced quietly, through moments that teach you when your voice is optional. I didn't confront him. I didn't rehearse speeches in my head. I didn't withdraw. On the surface, nothing changed. But internally, a new process began. I started tracking how often I adjusted myself to maintain smoothness. How often my discomfort was smoothed over by my own reasoning before anyone else had the chance to dismiss it. I asked myself questions I'd never asked before. When did I last insist on being heard? How often did I defer because it felt easier? Who benefited when I stayed quiet? There was no anger in these questions, only curiosity. That first small cut didn't break trust. It tested it. And what it revealed was not malice, but complacency, a comfort with my silence that had grown unnoticed. I realized something then, though I wouldn't fully understand it until much later. People don't push past boundaries they know exist. They push past the ones that go unspoken. And I had been very quiet about mine. After the first small cut, nothing dramatic followed. No escalation, no confrontation, just repetition. That's how normalization works. Not through intensity, but through frequency. Moments like that began to appear in different settings. A comment here, a decision there. Each one was minor enough to ignore on its own, but together forming a pattern that was harder to dismiss. Still, I tried. When he summarized conversations we'd had privately, as if they were his conclusions alone, I told myself he was simplifying for others. When plans changed without discussion, I reasoned that flexibility was part of partnership. When my objections were met with explanations instead of consideration, I framed it as miscommunication. I became fluent in self-translation. I edited my own reactions before they reached the surface. If something felt dismissive, I asked myself whether I was over-interpreting. If something felt unfair, I searched for context that might justify it. I believed that understanding someone else's perspective was the mature response. And I was very good at it. At the same time, something subtle shifted in how I spoke. I began qualifying my sentences before anyone else could challenge them. I might be wrong, but this isn't a big deal. It's probably nothing, but those phrases slipped in quietly, almost unconsciously. They made my words easier to accept and easier to ignore. What disturbed me wasn't that he disagreed with me. It was how rarely he asked. How often he responded to my feelings with solutions or logic or reassurance that didn't require him to change anything. As if the goal was to return me to calm, not to understand what had disrupted it. And because I valued calm, I let it work. In public, I remained the composed one. The partner who didn't correct, didn't contradict, didn't air things out. People admired that. They commented on how easygoing I was, how I never made things awkward. What they didn't see was the quiet labor behind that ease. At some point, I realized that my silence was being interpreted as endorsement. The absence of resistance had become a kind of consent. Decisions were made faster, with less consultation. My preferences were acknowledged in theory, but rarely prioritized in practice. And still nothing seemed wrong enough to justify making a scene. I told myself that long relationships require compromise, that choosing which battles to fight was wisdom, not avoidance, that love meant giving grace. But there's a difference between grace and erasure. And I was beginning to feel the outline of myself fading, not emotionally, but positionally. My role was being subtly downgraded from equal participant to supportive presence. What made it harder was how invisible this process was to everyone else. Friends would say how balanced we were, how we never fought, how lucky we were to be so aligned. I nodded, smiled, agreed. Inside, I started keeping track, not of slights, but of patterns. How often my needs were deferred, how frequently my discomfort was reframed as a misunderstanding, how smoothly the system worked as long as I remained predictable. I noticed how quickly things stalled when I hesitated, when I didn't immediately adapt. There was confusion then. Mild irritation, as if the mechanism had encountered unexpected resistance. That's when it became clear. My role had been optimized for efficiency. I wasn't being mistreated in obvious ways. I was being relied upon to absorb friction, to make things work without requiring adjustments from anyone else. And because I was capable of doing that, it was assumed I always would. I didn't feel trapped. I felt taken for granted. The hardest part was admitting that to myself, because it meant acknowledging that my own behavior had helped create this dynamic. I had taught people what to expect from me. I had rewarded convenience with compliance. So I did what I always did when something felt off. I went quiet, not withdrawn, just observant. I stopped rushing to explain myself. I let pauses stretch. I listened more than I spoke, not out of deference, but out of data gathering. And in that silence, I began to understand something crucial. Disrespect doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it's introduced as comfort and normalized as routine. Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. It wasn't that anyone sat me down and told me who I was supposed to be. There was no formal assignment, no explicit agreement. The role emerged gradually, shaped by repetition and reinforced by reward. Every time I smoothed something over, the system worked better. For everyone but me. I was the reliable one, the flexible one, the person who could be counted on to adapt. An adaptation became my defining trait. At work, this looked like being looped in late on decisions I was expected to implement flawlessly. I wasn't asked whether timelines were realistic. I was trusted to make them work. When something went right, it was a team win. When something faltered, I was quietly asked to fix it. In my marriage, the role was more personal, but just as clear. I was the emotional stabilizer, the one who remembered, the one who adjusted plans, moods, and expectations. If there was tension, I was expected to dissolve it, not by addressing its source, but by neutralizing its impact. What made this role so difficult to challenge was how reasonable it sounded. Who doesn't want to be seen as capable, as mature, as easy to be with? The problem was that capability became an obligation. Once people learned I could carry weight without complaint, they stopped checking whether I should. Once they learned I wouldn't escalate, they stopped moderating themselves. The role hardened into expectation, and expectation hardened into entitlement. I noticed how often my presence was assumed, but my absence caused inconvenience. How my agreement was inferred, but my dissent required explanation. How my labor, emotional and otherwise, was invisible precisely because it was consistent. There was a moment, small but clarifying, when I realized how deeply this role had been internalized. We were discussing a future plan, something that would affect both of us significantly. He spoke as if the outcome was already decided. When I gently asked when we were going to talk it through, he looked surprised. Not defensive, just genuinely confused. "I thought we already had," he said. We hadn't. Not really. We'd touched on it, circled it, but a full discussion, one where my preferences shaped the outcome, had never happened. In his mind, my earlier lack of objection had settled it. That was when I understood. My silence had been doing more work than my words ever had. I wasn't angry at him in that moment. I was clear about how the role functioned and how easily it erased me while appearing cooperative. Clear about how being understanding had slowly replaced being consulted. I also saw my own complicity. I had accepted praise instead of partnership. I had prioritized smoothness over accuracy. I had believed that being low friction made me valuable. But value, I was learning, is not the same as agency. The role I was assigned required me to be endlessly accommodating, but strangely replaceable. Appreciated, but not centered. Trusted, but not deferred to. And because I performed it so well, no one questioned whether it was fair. That's the danger of roles like this. They don't feel oppressive. They feel earned. You're rewarded for them with approval, stability, and the illusion of harmony. But they come at a cost. The gradual outsourcing of your voice. I didn't decide to rebel. I didn't plan an exit. I simply stopped assuming that the role was fixed. I began asking myself different questions. What happens if I don't adjust first? What happens if I let discomfort exist? Who steps up when I step back? These weren't threats. They were experiments. And what they revealed would change everything. The shift didn't happen during a fight. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, in a space so familiar I could have navigated it with my eyes closed. No raised voices, no accusations, just a moment of stillness that arrived without warning and refused to leave. I was sitting alone at the kitchen table, reviewing something mundane, an email thread, I think. It wasn't the content that mattered. It was the silence around me, the absence of urgency. For the first time in a long while, no one needed anything from me in that moment. And in that quiet, a thought surfaced with startling clarity. If I stopped holding everything together, how much would actually fall apart? It wasn't a bitter thought. It wasn't even emotional. It felt almost academic, like a hypothesis waiting to be tested. Up until then, my internal adjustments had been framed as patience, maturity, a long-term view, but suddenly I saw them for what they also were: maintenance. Constant, unseen maintenance that ensured the system ran smoothly. And systems, I realized, rarely ask whether the maintenance crew is tired. I looked back over the past few years, not through the lens of emotion, but through structure. Who initiated conversations? Who followed up? Who noticed when something was off and corrected course before it became visible? The answer was consistent. What struck me wasn't resentment, it was imbalance. I had been operating as a stabilizing force in a structure that did not stabilize me in return. And because I was good at it, the imbalance had never triggered an alarm. It had simply become the norm. That afternoon, something inside me recalibrated, not dramatically, not painfully, just decisively. I realized I had been confusing endurance with alignment. Endurance can keep things going for a long time, but it doesn't mean they're going in the right direction. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't journal furiously or cry in the bathroom. I finished my coffee. I closed my laptop. I went for a walk. Everything on the surface remained unchanged. But internally, a line had been crossed. For the first time, I stopped asking, how do I keep this peaceful? And started asking, is this reciprocal? That question changed how I listened, how I paused, how I responded. I noticed how often my default was to anticipate needs before they were expressed, to preempt discomfort, to solve problems before they are acknowledged. That afternoon, I decided, quietly, not to do that anymore. Not as a punishment, as an experiment. If something needed to be addressed, I would let it be addressed by the person it belonged to. If a decision required consensus, I would wait to be invited into it. If silence created tension, I would let that tension exist. This wasn't withdrawal, it was a restraint, and it felt unfamiliar. In the days that followed, small moments confirmed that something fundamental had shifted. When I didn't immediately smooth over a misunderstanding, it lingered longer than usual. When I didn't volunteer reassurance, it was noticed. There was confusion, but also revelation. I saw how much emotional labor I had been performing without recognition. Not because it was maliciously demanded, but because it had been reliably provided. I saw how my presence had been functioning as a buffer, absorbing impact that would otherwise require adjustment from others. And for the first time, I allowed that adjustment to be required. That afternoon didn't make me stronger. It made it clearer. Clear that my calm was not an obligation. Clear that my silence was not neutral. Clear that I had options I'd never considered because I'd never needed to. The shift wasn't about leaving, or staying, or winning. It was about agency. And once you feel that return, even quietly, there's no unfeeling it. There is a difference between silence that is imposed and silence that is chosen. Before, my quiet had been reactive. It was the absence of response after a calculation. Is this worth addressing? Will speaking help or complicate things? Most of the time, I concluded it wasn't worth it. So I stayed quiet, believing that restraint was wisdom. After the shift, silence became deliberate. I no longer use it to avoid discomfort. I used it to observe what happened in its absence. When I stopped preemptively explaining myself, conversations changed shape. Pauses stretched longer. Questions went unanswered until someone else filled the space. I noticed how often people relied on my cues to know what to do next, and how unsettled they seemed when those cues didn't arrive. At home, this was subtle, but unmistakable. Decisions that once flowed smoothly now stalled, not because I resisted, but because I didn't facilitate. I waited. I listened. I allowed others to take responsibility for the momentum. It was uncomfortable, not for me, but for the system. My husband began misinterpreting my restraint as distance, then as a distraction, then eventually as disinterest. He asked if I was tired, if work was stressful, if something was wrong. I answered honestly, but not expansively. I'm fine, I said, and I was. What I didn't do was reassure him beyond that. I didn't soften my tone to make the statement easier to accept. I didn't add qualifiers or apologies. I let my words stand on their own. This unsettled him more than any confrontation would have. Silence, when it's no longer predictable, becomes a mirror. It reflects the assumptions people have been operating under. At work, the change was similar. I stopped jumping in to resolve things that weren't mine to fix. When asked to take on tasks without context or authority, I asked questions instead of adapting. Not aggressively, just neutrally. What's the priority here? Who's responsible for the final decision? Can you clarify expectations? These questions didn't challenge anyone's competence, but they did challenge the assumption that I would absorb ambiguity without protest. Some people adjusted quickly, others didn't. What fascinated me was how often my silence was mistaken for weakness, as if not asserting myself loudly meant I was disengaging, as if calm equaled compliance. I watched people speak over me more boldly at first, as though testing whether the old version of me would reappear. When I didn't, there was a brief confusion, followed by recalibration. Silence, I learned, is only invisible when it's expected. When it's chosen, it becomes noticeable. I didn't announce a boundary. I didn't explain my internal shift. I let behavior do the communicating. I allowed gaps to exist. I allowed others to feel the friction I had been quietly absorbing for years. And in doing so, I gained something unexpected. Clarity about who respected me without my constant effort, and who only valued me when I was useful. This wasn't empowerment in the cinematic sense. It was quieter, more surgical. I wasn't withdrawing emotionally. I was withdrawing labor. And that distinction mattered, because the more I stepped back, the more I saw how uneven the dynamic had been. How much of the relationship's smoothness had depended on my willingness to disappear slightly. I didn't feel angry about this. I felt informed. Silence, when chosen, reveals structure. It shows you where the weight actually rests. It exposes who notices when balance shifts and who only notices when convenience is disrupted. By the time others began to sense something was different, it was already too late to return to the old version of me. That version had been maintained by reflex. This one was maintained by choice. What they never noticed wasn't some dramatic transformation. It was preparation. Because while my presence seemed unchanged, same routines, same tone, same outward calm, something else was happening beneath the surface. Not scheming, not plotting, just paying attention with a level of precision I had never needed before. When you stop spending energy managing other people's comfort, you suddenly have a surplus. And that surplus goes somewhere. Mine went into clarity. I began documenting, not obsessively, not emotionally, but methodically. Conversations, decisions, patterns. Not to build a case against anyone, but to understand the structure I was living inside. I wanted to see it as it actually was, not as it was supposed to be. I noticed how often commitments were implied, but never stated. How responsibility flowed downward, while authority flowed elsewhere. How accountability dissolved when it became inconvenient. At home, I paid attention to the difference between what we decided and what I assumed. The moments when my agreement was presumed without being asked. The subtle rewriting of history that happened when no one challenged it. I didn't correct those moments anymore. I noted them. At work, I began mapping influence. Who made decisions? Who executed them? Who received credit? Who absorbed fallout? Once you see that map clearly, you can't unsee it. And I saw where I stood on it. What surprised me was how little resistance there was to my quiet observation. No one felt threatened. Why would they? I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't changed my demeanor. I was still helpful, just no longer anticipatory. That distinction mattered more than anyone realized. I also began learning. Not in a dramatic, overnight way, but steadily. I reviewed documents I'd previously skimmed. I asked questions that clarified ownership. I educated myself on processes I'd been adjacent to, but never fully invited into. I wasn't trying to take control. I was reclaiming visibility. And because I did it without announcement, it went unnoticed. At home, I stopped shielding my husband from the natural consequences of his assumptions. If something was forgotten, I didn't remind. If a plan was incomplete, I didn't fill in the gaps. I let reality respond instead of me. At first, this was mistaken for oversight, then for distraction, then quietly, for independence. I could see him recalibrating in real time, though he didn't name it. He sensed a shift but couldn't locate it. I was still kind, still present, still calm, just no longer compensating. And that unsettled him. What he never noticed was how much ground I was gaining internally. Not leverage in the dramatic sense, but self-trust. The kind that comes from seeing patterns clearly and knowing you're not imagining them. I wasn't gathering ammunition, I was gathering truth. I noticed how often decisions were framed as inevitable when they were simply unchallenged. How narratives solidified when no one interrupted them. How power prefers silence, not because it fears noise, but because silence is easier to shape. And I stopped being shaped by it. There was a quiet satisfaction in this phase, not pleasure exactly, but steadiness. I wasn't waiting for anything to happen. I wasn't hoping for change. I was preparing for options. Options require information, so I collected it. I learned what was flexible and what wasn't. What was documented and what was assumed. Where responsibility actually lived and where it was merely implied. I learned which conversations mattered and which were performance. All of this happened without confrontation, without secrecy, without drama. That's the part people misunderstand about preparation. They imagine it as tension-filled, emotionally charged, but mine felt almost peaceful. Like aligning pieces on a board, I had finally learned to read. By the time anyone sensed a shift, I was already standing on firmer ground. Ground I had built quietly, while they were still responding to the version of me that no longer existed. What they never noticed was that my silence had stopped being passive long before it stopped being convenient. And once preparation is complete, the next phase doesn't feel risky. It feels inevitable. The reveal didn't come with adrenaline. There was no rush, no surge of triumph, just a moment of stillness where everything finally aligned, and I understood exactly where I stood. It happened late one evening, alone, with documents spread out in front of me. Not secrets, not anything illegally obtained, just information that had always been available but never examined together. I hadn't gone looking for leverage, I had gone looking for truth. And truth, when assembled patiently, has weight. What I saw was not betrayal in the dramatic sense. No hidden affairs, no stolen money, nothing cinematic. What emerged instead was something more unsettling, a consistent pattern of advantage built on assumption. Assumption that I would agree, assumption that I would adapt, assumption that I would protect the image, ours, his, the structure itself. The marriage hadn't broken up because of one act. It had exposed him because of the accumulation. I realized how many decisions had been finalized without my informed consent. How many compromises had only flowed in one direction. How often my labor, emotional, logistical, reputational, had been used as a stabilizer without acknowledgement. Seeing it all together stripped it of ambiguity. This wasn't about intention, it was about the outcome. And the outcome was clear. The system worked well for him, as long as I remained predictable. What struck me most was how unnecessary secrecy had been. Nothing here required deception to function. It relied entirely on my silence and good faith, on my willingness to fill gaps and smooth edges without asking whether I should. That realization changed how I felt, not angry, but resolved. I saw where my leverage actually was. Not in threats, not in exposure, but in withdrawal, in accuracy, in refusing to continue the role that made the imbalance sustainable. For the first time, I understood something fundamental. I didn't need to convince anyone of anything. I didn't need to prove harm. I didn't need to demand understanding. I didn't need validation. I needed alignment. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not because I was anxious, but because my mind was unusually quiet. The questions that had looped for years were gone. In their place was a simple clarity. I knew what continuing as before would cost me, and I knew what stopping would cost him. Not as punishment, but as a consequence. There was no celebration in this realization. No sense of victory. Just a sober understanding of reality as it was, not as I had hoped it to be. I closed the documents. I cleaned the table. I went to bed. The next morning, nothing looked different. We spoke normally. We moved through routines. To anyone watching, the image remained intact. But internally, something irreversible had happened. I had crossed from uncertainty into knowledge. And knowledge changes how you move. I became careful, not secretive, intentional, not reactive. I stopped filling the silence with reassurance. I stopped correcting misunderstandings that benefited him. I stopped translating my needs into palatable versions. I didn't confront him with what I knew. Not because I was afraid, but because confrontation wasn't the point. Exposure wasn't necessary. What mattered was choice. I now understood exactly what I was participating in, and what would happen if I stopped. That clarity was my private reveal. And once you have it, you don't rush. You don't argue. You don't explain. You decide. Clarity simplifies things. Once the private reveal settled, the noise disappeared. There were no more internal debates, no rehearsed conversations playing out in my head. I wasn't weighing possibilities emotionally anymore. I was evaluating options structurally, and there were options. I could continue as before, now fully aware of the imbalance. I could attempt to renegotiate the dynamic, name the patterns, request change, hope for accountability that had never been self-initiated, or I could choose the option that required the least explanation and the most integrity. Each path had consequences. Staying would mean accepting the role consciously, knowing it would require constant vigilance to prevent further erosion. Renegotiation would mean becoming the educator of my own worth, explaining impact, managing defensiveness, moderating discomfort. That path demanded energy I no longer wished to give. The third option was quieter but irreversible. It didn't involve ultimatums or dramatic exits. It involved disengaging from the structure that depended on my silence to function. It meant stopping my participation in a system that required me to disappear slightly in order to survive. This was the option I chose, not because it was easiest, but because it was clean. I didn't announce the decision. I didn't test the waters. I simply aligned my actions with my understanding. I began making choices that no longer assumed the preservation of the image was my responsibility. I also took time to sit with the weight of that choice. I asked myself hard questions. Was I willing to be misunderstood? Was I prepared for him to be confused or even hurt? Was I okay with losing the version of myself others were comfortable with? The answer to all of them was yes, because what I was losing was not myself. It was the performance. I didn't hate him. That mattered to me. I didn't want him to suffer, but I also refused to continue cushioning him from the reality of his behavior. This wasn't revenge. It was released. There was a calm finality to this phase. Once the decision was made, there was no urgency, no countdown. I didn't need closure from him. I didn't need agreement. I needed consistency. So I began moving in a way that reflected my choice. Subtly at first. I took back time. I redirected energy. I stopped managing narratives that weren't mine to carry. And because I did this without announcement, it went unnoticed. People assume that turning points are loud. Those decisions declare themselves, but the most irreversible ones often look like nothing at all from the outside. Internally, though, everything had changed. I was no longer waiting for him to see me differently. I was no longer hoping for recognition. I was no longer protecting the version of us that only existed because I sustained it. I had chosen alignment over attachment. And once that choice is made, the next steps don't require courage. They require follow-through. Once the decision was made, I didn't feel the need to explain myself to the world. I moved quietly, not because I was hiding, but because there was nothing to announce. I wasn't acting against anyone. I was acting for myself, and that kind of movement doesn't need witnesses. I began with the practical, not impulsively, methodically. I separated what had been shared out of convenience from what needed to be clarified out of respect. I reviewed documents I had previously trusted without question. I made sure I understood timelines, responsibilities, and implications, legal, financial, structural, not to gain advantage, but to remove ambiguity. Ambiguity had never served me. I didn't rush. Rushed decisions come from emotion. Mine came from alignment. Each step was small enough to appear inconsequential on its own, but together they formed a new foundation. I reclaimed ownership where it had been blurred. I stopped agreeing to arrangements that relied on my flexibility instead of fairness. I asked for things in writing, not confrontationally, just clearly. I ensured that my name was attached to what I was responsible for and absent from what I was not. At home, the changes were almost invisible. I didn't withdraw affection. I didn't become cold. I simply stopped over-functioning. If something required coordination, I waited for it to be coordinated. If a decision affected both of us, I expected it to be discussed, not assumed. The silence I moved into was not empty, it was precise. What surprised me was how little anyone noticed at first. Systems don't alarm when one component stops compensating. They just feel less efficient. Things take longer, friction appears, small inconveniences surface. And people attribute that to stress, or timing, or distraction, not to structural change. My husband sensed something was different, but couldn't identify it. He would pause mid-sentence, as if waiting for me to fill in a gap. When I didn't, he'd continue, slightly off balance. He began double-checking things he'd never questioned before. I watched this without judgment. I wasn't withholding. I was allowing reality to function without my constant intervention. At work, the shift was clearer. When I stopped absorbing uncertainty, it had to be addressed elsewhere. When I declined to just handle it, responsibilities became visible, not because I exposed them, but because I no longer hid them. No one accused me of anything. No one confronted me. The image remained intact. That was the quiet dominance of it. I wasn't burning bridges, I was stepping off them. Moving in silence doesn't mean moving alone. It means moving without narration, without justification, without the need to be understood in advance. I didn't need anyone's permission to realign my life with my values. I didn't need a consensus to stop performing a role that no longer fit. By the time consequences began to surface, my position was already stable. That's the advantage of quiet movement. By the time others feel the shift, you're no longer standing where they expect you to be. Consequences rarely arrive all at once. They start as absences. The first thing people noticed wasn't something breaking. It was something missing. Responses took longer, plans required more clarification. Emotional reassurance didn't arrive on cue. The invisible scaffolding I had provided for years was gone, and without it, the structure felt unfamiliar. Not unstable, just... At home, my husband began encountering friction in places where there had never been any. Not arguments, confusion. He would ask questions he'd never asked before, as if trying to locate a manual that had quietly disappeared. Did we decide this already? Can you remind me when that's happening? I thought you were handling that, I answered honestly. I don't remember deciding that. I'm not sure. I thought you were. I wasn't aware it was mine. Each response was calm, accurate, uncharged, and each one landed harder than anger ever could. He wasn't losing me in a dramatic sense. I was still there, still present, still kind. What he was losing was ease, the ease of assumption, the ease of momentum that came from knowing someone else would catch what he dropped. At first, he reacted with mild irritation, not directed at me, at circumstances. Things were suddenly more complicated, less efficient. He blamed timing, stress, external pressure. But gradually something deeper surfaced, uncertainty. He began revisiting conversations, asking questions about things he'd previously taken for granted. He tried to re-establish rhythm by reverting to old patterns, speaking in conclusions, moving quickly, expecting alignment. And each time, he met a pause instead of reinforcement. That pause forced him to slow down. I could see the discomfort in that. Not anger, disorientation. The realization that the system he was used to navigating no longer responded the same way. What struck me was how quickly the narrative shifted internally for him. He wasn't thinking, I dismissed her. He was thinking, why is this suddenly harder? That's how consequences often feel to the person experiencing them. Like friction without a clear source. Outside our marriage, the effects rippled quietly. Friends noticed small changes. I was less available to mediate, less eager to smooth. I listened more than I reassured. Some people adjusted, others drifted. No confrontations followed, no accusations, just subtle recalibrations of access. At work, responsibilities that had once defaulted to me were redistributed. Not because I demanded it, but because I no longer absorbed them. Meetings took longer. Decisions required more explicit ownership. Some colleagues struggled with that. Again, no one blamed me. They simply felt the loss of something they'd never named. That's the nature of invisible labor. It's only recognized when it stops. What mattered most to me during this phase was restraint. It would have been easy to point out the changes, to say, this is what I used to do, to demand recognition. I didn't, because recognition wasn't the goal, accuracy was. I wasn't interested in being missed. I was interested in being aligned. As the consequences continued to surface, I noticed something else. My own steadiness deepened. I wasn't bracing anymore. I wasn't monitoring reactions or managing outcomes. I was simply responding truthfully in real time. That truthfulness, quiet as it was, altered every interaction. By the time my husband began to sense that something fundamental had shifted, the consequences were already in motion. Not as punishment, but as a natural result. The structure was adjusting to my absence from a role I had quietly vacated. And adjustment, once required, cannot be undone by nostalgia. By the time he realized something was wrong, he framed it as a misunderstanding. That's a common response when comfort disappears without warning. The mind searches for a version of events that can be corrected. Something small, something recent, something that can be fixed with the right conversation. He began asking more questions, not accusations, concerns. He wanted to check in, to make sure we were okay. His tone was careful, almost cautious, as if he were approaching a surface he wasn't sure would hold. I listened. I noticed how his questions focused on outcomes, not patterns. On restoring ease, not examining its source. He wanted to know what had changed, not what had been happening all along. And that told me everything. He offered adjustments, small ones, more communication, more consideration. He promised to be better about things. The language was vague, but well-intentioned. It was the language of someone who believed the problem had just recently appeared. What he didn't understand was that the window for correction had passed, not because I was unforgiving, but because I was no longer participating in negotiation. Negotiation requires uncertainty. I no longer had any. I wasn't closed off. I wasn't cold. But I was no longer available for the role he was trying to fill. The role where my silence absorbed imbalance and my patience masked erosion. He sensed this and became uneasy. The more he tried to re-establish the old rhythm, the more obvious it became that it depended on something I wasn't offering anymore. He couldn't articulate what that something was, but he felt its absence acutely. That's when panic entered the picture. Not loud panic, quiet urgency. He started revisiting past moments, trying to locate the point of rupture, asking if there was a specific incident, a comment, a fight, something he could apologize for. There wasn't, and that frustrated him, because you can't fix what you can't isolate. You can't undo a pattern by addressing a moment. I didn't weaponize this clarity. I didn't say you should have noticed sooner. I didn't list grievances. I didn't escalate. I simply told the truth, calmly, without detail. I don't feel aligned anymore. That sentence landed heavier than anything else I could have said. Alignment can't be restored through promises. It requires shared reality. And by the time he was ready to examine that reality, I had already stepped out of it. He asked if I was willing to try, to work on things, to give it time. I told him I had already given my time. What he experienced as sudden withdrawal was, for me, the result of a long internal process. One he hadn't noticed because it had been quiet. Because I had continued to function. Because I had protected the image. That's the paradox of emotional labor. It delays the visibility of consequences until they are irreversible. By the time the damage is felt, the capacity to repair has often been exhausted. He wasn't a villain. He wasn't cruel. He was simply late. And lateness, in matters of alignment, is not a moral failure. It's a structural one. There was sadness in this phase. Not dramatic grief, but a steady mourning of what could have been different if awareness had arrived sooner. If curiosity had replaced assumption. If presence had replaced convenience. But regret doesn't reverse reality. And by the time he understood that something essential had been lost, it was no longer mine to restore. When the conversation finally happened, the one that couldn't be postponed or reframed, it was quieter than anyone would expect. No raised voices, no accusations, no dramatic revelations. We sat across from each other, familiar space, familiar light. He looked tired, not defensive, just worn down by uncertainty. I recognized that look. It was the same one I'd carried for years, only mine had been invisible. He began carefully, as if choosing the wrong word might break something beyond repair. I don't understand when this happened, he said. You never said you were unhappy. I nodded. Not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. I wasn't unhappy all at once, I replied. I was paying attention. That confused him. He asked me to explain, to give examples, to help him see what he had missed. I didn't. Not because I couldn't, but because explanation would have shifted us back into the old dynamic. The one where I translate my experience into something manageable, something debatable, something he could respond to with logic or intention. I wasn't there to be processed. I don't want to litigate the past, I said calmly. I want to be honest about the present. That was the moment he realized this wasn't a negotiation. There was no anger in my voice, no bitterness. I wasn't trying to convince him of wrongdoing. I was stating a fact. I no longer fit inside the structure we had built together. He asked if I was saying he failed. I told him no. I'm saying the system worked, I said, just not for both of us. That landed hard. He tried again, this time softer. He said he could change, that he was willing to listen now, that he wished I'd told him sooner. I believed him, and I told him that too. I believe you would try, I said. I just don't believe I can return to the role that made trying necessary. That was the truth. Change offered. After clarity doesn't always arrive in time. Not because it's insincere, but because it asks someone to re-enter a position they've already outgrown. He went quiet then. Not angry, not pleading, just absorbing. The confrontation ended the way it had unfolded, without heat, without victory, without collapse. There were no dramatic final lines, no door slamming, just an understanding settling into the room that something fundamental had concluded. When we stood up, there was respect in the space between us. Sadness, too, but also inevitability. I didn't leave feeling powerful. I left feeling complete. For the first time, I wasn't carrying the emotional weight of someone else's learning curve. I wasn't waiting to be understood. I wasn't managing the aftermath. I had told the truth without defending it, and that, I realized, was the quietest form of dominance there is. Who I am now looks, from the outside, surprisingly similar. I still speak calmly. I still listen more than I talk. I still value thoughtfulness over noise. The difference is not in my temperament, it's in my orientation. I no longer bend toward what is expected of me. After the confrontation, there was no dramatic reinvention, no urge to announce a new identity or burn down the old one. I didn't need to become louder to prove I existed. I didn't need to harden to protect myself. What changed was my center of gravity. Before, it lived outside me, in the maintenance of relationships, the smoothing of systems, the anticipation of needs. Now, it lives inside. Decisions are made based on alignment, not appeasement. I measure my responses by accuracy, not impact. That shift brought an unexpected kind of peace. I noticed how much lighter my days felt without the constant background calculation. I no longer rehearsed conversations in advance. I no longer monitored rooms for emotional weather. I entered situations as myself, not as a buffer. Some relationships adjusted naturally, others faded. That didn't feel like loss. It felt like sorting. The people who remained were those who didn't need me to be smaller in order to feel comfortable, those who asked instead of assumed, those who noticed when I paused and waited rather than rushing to fill the space. I learned that being calm doesn't mean being available. Being kind doesn't mean being flexible. Being capable doesn't mean being responsible for everything. These distinctions sound simple, but they take time to internalize, especially if you've been rewarded your whole life for collapsing them. I didn't emerge from this experience bitter. That mattered to me. I didn't want clarity to calcify into resentment. I let myself grieve quietly, for the version of the marriage that could have existed, for the years spent believing endurance was love. But grief passed. What remained was self-respect. I trust myself now in a way I didn't before. Not because I'm stronger, but because I'm clearer. I recognize patterns early. I name them internally. And if something requires me to disappear slightly in order to continue, I no longer negotiate with that requirement. I step away. That doesn't make me rigid, it makes me precise. I still believe in partnership, in collaboration, in mutual growth. But I no longer confuse potential with reality or intention with impact. I no longer stay in systems that only function when I absorb the cost. Who I am now is not a reaction to what happened. It's a return to the version of myself that doesn't need to be explained in order to be valid, that doesn't require permission to take up space, that doesn't promote calmness to earn safety. Quiet dominance isn't about control, it's about self-location. And once you know where you stand, you don't have to push. There's a version of this story that could be framed as a warning, a cautionary tale about missed signals, unspoken resentment, and the cost of complacency. But I don't believe stories like this are meant to scare us. I think they're meant to clarify. Our marriage didn't break because of one moment or one mistake. It ended because a system built on assumptions was finally seen for what it was. It was. And when I stopped protecting the image, the truth surfaced. Not dramatically, not cruelly, but unmistakably. That truth wasn't that he was irredeemable. It wasn't that I was flawless. It was that imbalance, when left unexamined, that becomes identity. I had learned how to be low friction so well that it replaced being known. And he had learned how to rely on that frictionlessness without ever questioning its source. Neither of us set out to create that dynamic, but intention doesn't cancel impact. The moral of this story isn't speak up sooner or never compromise. Those lessons are too simple. Sometimes speaking sooner wouldn't have changed, and sometimes compromise is love. The deeper lesson is this. Pay attention to who benefits from your silence. If a system, whether a relationship, a workplace, or a family, only works when you absorb the discomfort, that's not harmony, that's extraction. And it will continue for as long as you make it easy. Quiet dominance doesn't come from confrontation. It comes from clarity, from knowing when to stop cushioning reality for others, from choosing alignment even when it costs you familiarity, approval, or the comfort of being misunderstood. There was no revenge in my leaving, no satisfaction in watching someone scramble to catch up. just a steady sense that I had finally stepped out of a role that no longer fit and into a life that didn't require me to disappear to function. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of yourself, not in anger, but in quiet recognition, then this story has done what it was meant to do. You don't need to make noise to matter. You don't need to justify clarity. And you don't owe anyone the version of you that made their life easier at your expense. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop holding something together and see what remains. So I'll leave you with this question, one I genuinely love to hear your thoughts on in the comments. Have you ever realized that your silence was protecting a system that didn't protect you back? And what did you do when you saw it clearly? Thank you for listening.